Parfait. Bonjour à tous ou rebonjour si vous nous rejoignez pour la suite de cette journée de colloque. Donc là, on va s'attaquer au panel numéro 7 qui traite de l'interdisciplinarité dans l'étude du populisme. Je vais m'exprimer en français parce que clairement, c'est ma première langue, mais si vous préférez que je m'adresse à vous en anglais ou si vous voulez poser vos questions en anglais ou que j'y réponde en anglais, n'hésitez pas. Donc cet après-midi, nous avons la chance d'avoir avec nous Mathieu Lizotte de l'Université d'Ottawa, Peker de l'Université d'Ottawa également, et Hasan Faruk Uslu de l'Atatürk University en Turquie. Je vais peut-être commencer par toi tout de suite, Mathieu, pour rentrer dans le vif du sujet. Donc, tu es professeur adjoint à la faculté des sciences sociales de l'Université d'Ottawa et tu t'intéresses à une question qui est assez centrale pour nous aujourd'hui, la question des inégalités sociales et des enjeux moraux qu'elles soulèvent. Et comme tu es habité par plusieurs questions qui convergent assez bien avec la question du populisme, ça va être assez intéressant, je crois, de t'entendre, puisque en t'intéressant à la question de qu'est-ce qu'on reçoit, qu'est-ce qu'on pense recevoir, ou bien encore qu'est-ce qu'on mérite ou non de recevoir, bien sûr, on tombe tout de suite dans les questions de ressentiment, de sentiment de dépossession, voire d'aliénation. Donc ça, c'est évidemment des sujets qu'on rattache assez logiquement à l'étude des populismes. Donc, on va t'entendre tout de suite pour ouvrir ce panel dans lequel tu vas partager avec nous tes réflexions sur les explications psychologiques du populisme. Et on t'écoute.
Parfait. Alors, je te remercie pour cette belle introduction et je remercie aussi aux organisateurs de ce colloque pour cette belle occasion. Alors, comme Djamila vient de dire, je suis professeur de sociologie à l'École d'études sociologiques et anthropologiques de l'Université d'Ottawa. Il n'y aura pas de PowerPoint, hein, je vais mieux le dire tout de suite. Mon intérêt pour le populisme est lié à mon programme de recherche. Je m'intéresse à étudier les inégalités et les sentiments d'injustice en articulant à la fois l'objectif, le subjectif et le normatif, ce qui rajoute une complexité. Alors concrètement, cela revient à ce type de questions. Quel est le niveau objectif des inégalités? Comment l'individu et les divers groupes perçoivent-ils le niveau d'inégalité? Comment perçoivent-ils leur position à l'intérieur de la hiérarchie sociale? Et comment les perceptions des inégalités étaient liées à leur sentiment de justice? Et enfin, en ce qui concerne le normatif, quels sont les différents discours ou justifications des inégalités? Donc, qui mérite quoi selon les diverses idéologies? Selon quels critères des inégalités, selon quels critères finalement les inégalités sont-elles justifiées? Alors, mon intérêt aujourd'hui pour le populisme est vraiment tributaire à ce programme de recherche. Je suis un dilettante, en fait, dans le champ du populisme, mieux le dire ouvertement. J'ai profité de l'occasion de ce colloque, finalement, parce que ça fait longtemps que je voulais approfondir la relation entre le populisme et les inégalités. Plus précisément, cependant, aujourd'hui, je ferai quelques réflexions concernant les explications psychologiques du populisme et comment les intégrer en sociologie. Alors, mon intérêt envers la littérature psychologique est aussi dans le but ultime de conceptualiser l'acteur social dans toutes ses nuances, c'est-à-dire un acteur social qui n'est pas parfaitement égoïste ni angélique. Je m'intéresse à la manière d'intégrer à la fois la rationalité axiologique et la rationalité des émotions dans ce que Raymond Boudon appelait l'approche cognitive, ce qu'il a essayé de faire finalement, qui est un projet inachevé, comme beaucoup de choses. Alors, à cette fin, le cas du populisme, comme nous le verrons, est un sujet particulièrement fertile pour ce genre de réflexion. En somme, je parlerai brièvement de la théorie de la justification du système, l'émotion de la peur comme rationalité et comme fait social, et l'angoisse de statut, et par la suite le lien entre les inégalités et le populisme. Alors, il existe un champ de littérature psychologique que j'ai trouvé particulièrement intéressant qui porte sur la justification du statu quo. Certaines théories psychologiques s'intéressent à la manière dont l'individu justifie la société dans son état actuel. Par exemple, la théorie de la justification du système postule que les gens tendent à préférer les conditions économiques et sociales existantes afin de maintenir une vision favorable d'eux-mêmes et de leur position, ainsi que de la société dans laquelle ils vivent. En justifiant ce qui est, en reniant une certaine utopie, cela remplit une fonction psychologique, une fonction palliative de réduire le sentiment d'insécurité et de menace. Subjectivement, mais pas objectivement. En somme, c'est réconfortant de se dire que les choses ne sont pas si pires. La littérature psychologique suggère que les inégalités économiques tendent à réduire la satisfaction de vie. C'est une relation inverse, quoi. et de plus que cette relation serait modérée par la croyance envers un système juste. Autrement dit, qu'il y aurait un effet de modérateur pour les quantitativistes dans la salle. Il y a donc un biais cognitif qui incite les gens à croire que le système est juste pour se sentir mieux, car il est stressant et taxant sur le plan psychologique d'être constamment en indignation ou d'avoir le sentiment de faire avoir. Alors, les gens fuient le conflit et cela a de grands impacts politiques, comme vous avez sans doute aucune difficulté à l'imaginer. Alors, dit un peu crûment, cela favorise la croyance en une illusion qui est plus facile à avaler que la réalité. Alors, il y a beaucoup de travaux qui explorent cette facette, qui est tout à fait fascinante. Les populistes, par définition, croient que le système soit injuste. Cela est accompagné d'une énorme frustration. Mais la frustration politique est-elle dirigée dans la bonne direction? Plus les inégalités augmentent, plus on doit se dire des mensonges pour vivre dans notre petite bulle de tranquillité, selon la théorie de la justification du système. Il arrive un moment tragique où nos illusions ne sont plus tenables, un moment où l'on atteint une dissonance cognitive trop élevée. On a beau être optimiste, si le destin nous fait traverser l'Atlantique sur le Titanic, il arrive un moment où la réalité nous rattrape. On se réveille dans une situation critique, mais quelles sont les causes de cette conjoncture? À défaut d'une lecture critique, d'une éducation politique et d'une culture de presse de haut niveau, ainsi que d'un lectorat fidèle, intéressé et engagé, on peut facilement tenter à blâmer un peu n'importe qui et n'importe quoi, à blâmer le vent, et à trouver des cibles faciles. À ce sujet, il existe des études psychologiques intéressantes qui montrent des corrélations entre le populisme et les théories du complot. La croyance envers les théories de complot alimente le populisme. Et c'est une littérature assez fine, ce n'est pas toutes les théories du complot qui l'alimentent. Il y a des distinctions à faire, mais c'est quand même très intéressant. Alors, le sujet des théories du complot nous mène au sujet de la peur. Je suis persuadé qu'on aurait intérêt à focaliser davantage sur la peur dans nos analyses sociologiques. La littérature psychologique a beaucoup à nous dire à ce sujet. La peur structure énormément la vie sociale. Il mérite de le souligner. On peut se lamenter ad vitam aeternam du projet inachevé des Lumières et de l'estomplement de la raison, mais personnellement, j'estime que mon temps est mieux investi à identifier les conditions objectives qui obstruent ce projet. La peur est une piste importante à examiner. Peur du déclin, peur du déclassement. J'ai assisté aux conférences hier matin. C'est un sujet qui est revenu à plusieurs reprises. Il y a des thèmes récurrents, en effet. La peur de perdre le statu quo, la peur du changement. En termes de théorie du complot, c'est aussi la peur d'agir quand on se sent piégé dans un gigantesque et parfait complot en face duquel on est totalement impuissant. Du point de vue théorique, ce que Weber appelait la rationalité affective n'a pas été autant théorisé en sociologie, contrairement à la rationalité instrumentale et à ses nombreuses caricatures. Intégrer la peur comme fait social, c'est de conceptualiser la rationalité de l'acteur qui est plus réaliste finalement. La peur est un puissant motivateur. Dans l'arène politique, il y a ceux qui souhaitent l'apaiser, mais il y a aussi ceux qui souhaitent l'alimenter et la canaliser pour leur propre fin. Pas besoin d'avoir lu Le Prince de Machiavel pour le constater. La peur est la matière primaire du démagogue qui souhaite s'accaparer et maintenir son pouvoir en exploitant la peur, les émotions et les pulsions de la communauté politique, ou du moins de certains groupes à l'intérieur de la communauté. L'écrivain autrichien Karl Kraus avait écrit « The secret of the demagogue is to appear as dumb as his audience, so that these people can believe themselves as smart as he is. » Il y a certainement de la vérité là-dedans. La peur produit un terreau fertile au jeu du bouc émissaire, qui est une autre théorie qui ressort de la littérature psychologique. Le démagogue canalise la peur, la réifie et l'intensifie. C'est ici une facette importante qui permet de distinguer le populisme de l'action démocratique dite grassroots. Les deux types encouragent la participation politique des gens dits ordinaires, Mais d'une part, le populisme simplifie la cause d'un problème social, par exemple par la bouc émissiarisation d'un groupe, et l'histoire en donne maints exemples. Et d'autre part, le populisme comporte une sorte de délégation de son action politique dans les mains d'un chef autoritaire et charismatique. On est loin ici des pratiques constitutives de la moralité chez Durkheim. Alors, approfondissons maintenant l'une de ces peurs. La littérature psychologique contient de travaux intéressants sur l'angoisse de statut. C'est d'ailleurs un concept qui est utilisé beaucoup dans la sociologie des inégalités et dans la sociologie de la consommation. Cependant, la psychologie va l'examiner avec une plus grande profondeur, finalement, hein, par sa vocation. La littérature identifie au moins deux voies à la quête du statut. Il y a la voie du prestige et la voie de la dominance. La voie du prestige, finalement, on l'appellera en sociologie la voie du mérite. C'est où l'individu cherche le statut en cultivant des talents et des compétences qui sont communément valorisés et récompensés. Tandis que dans la voie de la dominance, l'individu tente d'acquérir un statut par la peur, l'intimidation et la coercition. De plus, l'acquisition de statut par dominance implique deux tactiques finalement, l'agression directe et l'agression indirecte. Dans l'agression directe, finalement, ça comporte la violence verbale et physique, c'est les menaces, toujours dirigées envers un adversaire perçu comme étant la source de leurs problèmes. Et dans l'agression indirecte, en fait, c'est une agression qui est considérée beaucoup plus complexe et subtile. Hein. En somme, cette tactique consiste à réduire la valeur d'un groupe dans le regard d'autrui, que ce soit par potin, en véhiculant de fausses informations, de stéréotypes, de préjugés, et ainsi de suite. On peut facilement subsumer ce genre de phénomène, hein, l'agression indirecte, dans le cadre de la violence symbolique ou même dans la philosophie de la reconnaissance. On peut le cadrer, finalement, l'agression indirecte peut aussi consister à mobiliser autrui envers un adversaire. Et il y a, dans la littérature psychologique, il y a beaucoup d'études qui s'intéressent justement à la mobilisation populiste. Hein. On identifie par exemple plusieurs méthodes de mobilisation, comme la moralisation, la diffusion de rumeurs et le followership. Alors, il est tenu pour acquis, dans l'épistémologie de la psychologie, que la quête du statut est universelle. Ce qui distingue les individus est plutôt la voie qu'ils vont emprunter pour acquérir ce statut. Ainsi, la littérature montre qu'on aurait, comme on aurait pu s'y attendre d'ailleurs, que les individus ayant une prouesse physique et un bas niveau d'empathie tendent à adopter la voie de la dominance, tandis que ceux qui ont davantage de capital humain et de capital social empruntent davantage la voie du prestige. En temps de crise, en temps de difficulté et d'intégration au marché du travail, ou plus généralement, finalement, pendant toute période où l'accès à la bonne vie est bloqué, les gens se réfugient dans des schèmes primaires de solidarité, famille, népotisme et race. Peterson, Osmundson et Bohr proposent que la montée du populisme et du mécontentement politique extrême sont fortement liées à la psychologie de la quête du statut et aux obstacles auxquels les gens font face dans cette quête. Certains psychologues soutiennent que le mécontentement politique extrême est lié à ceux qui empruntent la voie de la dominance. Des mesures ont été créées, des études ont été faites. Il y a des corrélations importantes entre ceux qui empruntent cette voie, la voie de la dominance, et le mécontentement politique et le populisme. Alors, en temps de crise ou dans le sillage d'une crise, il y a moins de ressources disponibles, l'angoisse du statut monte, et cela a certainement des conséquences politiques. Certains auteurs soutiennent que l'appui pour l'extrême droite est précisément lié aux motivations d'acquérir le statut via la dominance. Il n'est pas clair, cependant, s'ils sont totalement contraints de suivre cette voie. Il est davantage clair qu'ils ont le sentiment subjectif de l'être. C'est la voie finalement qui leur semble la plus raisonnable dans les contextes extrêmes. La littérature s'interroge également sur ce qui active ces stratégies. En sociologie, on dirait quelles sont les conditions objectives favorisant telle ou telle décision ou stratégie. La littérature souligne que la montée des inégalités augmente le besoin psychologique de se démarquer et donc la peur de se faire déclasser. Dans un contexte de prospérité, on peut anticiper que davantage de personnes emprunteront la voie du mérite, tandis que dans un contexte de récession, de crise économique et politique, on peut anticiper que davantage emprunteront la voie de la dominance. En somme, le comportement politique extrême semble lié au mécontentement que les individus ou les groupes ont avec leur propre position dans la hiérarchie sociale et d'une pulsion de corriger cette situation par la violence. D'autres auteurs, par contre, nuancent cette relation et soulignent que l'appui pour le populisme n'est pas toujours directement lié à sa propre position dans la hiérarchie, ni par sa satisfaction de vie. L'appui pour le populisme semble lié davantage directement à l'émotion, au sentiment de privation matérielle et non absolu, ainsi qu'au sentiment global que la société serait en déclin, ou du moins qu'une certaine vision de la société serait menacée. Alors, en conclusion, je recommande un dialogue plus étroit entre la sociologie et la psychologie. La psychologie sociale me semble très importante pour identifier à la fois les causes du populisme, donc les facteurs exacerbants, et les conditions objectives qui pourraient l'atténuer. Il est tout simplement caricatural de s'attendre à ce que l'acteur social agisse uniquement selon la raison. L'émotion structure la vie sociale beaucoup plus qu'on y accorde crédit. À cette fin, j'encourage tout dialogue qui permet d'examiner la rationalité de l'acteur social dans toute sa complexité, notamment en incorporant l'affect. Alors, il est trop facile de simplement dire que l'émotion est irrationnelle et de l'écarter. La psychologie nous offre une manière d'explorer en quelque sorte la rationalité des émotions, une rationalité dont la logique n'est pas a priori aussi transparente et accessible que la rationalité instrumentale. Et même si une partie des émotions m'effraie, car elles sont ô combien subjectives, et on peut facilement imaginer des dérives et même sortir des exemples, ne pas en tenir compte me ferait davantage peur. Ma recherche documentaire sur la littérature psychologique m'a permis de constater qu'il existe de nombreux parallèles avec la sociologie quant au populisme. On n'utilise pas forcément les mêmes concepts, mais il existe généralement des équivalents. La montée du populisme me fait beaucoup penser aux travaux d'Axel Honneth sur la reconnaissance. Honneth théorise la relation entre le gouvernement, où les décisions sont prises, l'espace public où les citoyens débattent, et la réalité quotidienne où la souffrance et les frustrations sont vécues. Il fait bien, Honneth, de souligner qu'aucun parti politique ou mouvement social réussit à capter parfaitement la souffrance et le ressentiment de la population dans toute sa complexité et sa totalité. Il faut aussi souligner qu'il existe des souffrances difficilement exprimables, car elles se manifestent de manière qui ne sont pas discutables en bonne société, ou dans ce que Honneth appelle la sphère publique bourgeoise. Certaines gens votent clairement pour le démagogue simplement parce que celui-ci est le premier, ou du moins l'un des rares, à reconnaître une certaine souffrance. La reconnaissance est déjà une drogue en soi. Le problème est si on n'attribue pas cette souffrance à la bonne cause et si on ne propose pas forcément les solutions les plus édifiantes ou, dit autrement, les plus équitables. Il est dangereux de négliger la souffrance des individus et des groupes. Ce sont de véritables bombes à retardement. Dans cet esprit, j'appuie la démarche d'Honneth lorsqu'il propose de faire une phénémologie de la souffrance. Cerner cette douleur pourrait permettre de la canaliser dans des modes d'action politique que j'oserais dire plus constructifs. À titre d'exemple, si on prend le cas de l'immigration, se montrer contre l'immigration est souvent critiqué et moralisé comme étant arriéré et petit. Tout bon citoyen du monde n'oserait jamais s'y opposer. Mais on peut aussi interpréter les positions contre l'immigration comme la manifestation de peur et de frustration légitimes. Je ne dis pas qu'on doit les accepter telles quelles sans critique, mais ces peurs et ces critiques méritent un examen profond. Elles méritent d'être écoutées et prises au sérieux au lieu d'être automatiquement et systématiquement écartés et ridiculisés. Les positions contre l'immigration ne sont pas forcément contre toute solidarité internationale. Elles peuvent simplement indiquer un ordonnancement de principes et de priorités. Par exemple, améliorer le sort des personnes qui sont déjà citoyens, surtout en période de crise. Privilégier trop l'international au détriment des citoyens peut certainement alimenter un sentiment d'injustice, surtout chez les plus démunis. Ça, je le constate plus ou moins à chaque fois que je prends un taxi et que je parle avec les chauffeurs. En somme, je suis critique des interprétations qui tendent davantage à moraliser les populistes qu'à les comprendre, car on peut finalement s'y perdre facilement dans des discours entre les vertueux et les vicieux et faire fi de souffrances réelles et souvent légitimes, mais pas toujours quand même, c'est à explorer, et des souffrances finalement qui alimentent les populismes en amont. Alors le populisme tire sa source d'une frustration et sur un sentiment d'injustice. Dans ce sens, elle offre une source potentielle puissante d'action politique s'il était possible de canaliser cette émotion dans une voie plus constructive. Et par cela, je désigne de ne pas privilégier les simplifications à outrance, notamment comme les théories du complot, de ne pas s'attaquer aux cibles faciles et à ne pas mettre tous les espoirs dans les mains d'un seul leader. Alors sur ça, je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, c'était vraiment incroyablement passionnant. J'ai hâte de te poser les 5 questions qui me sont venues en t'écoutant. Mais avant ça, on va tout de suite passer à Peker, que bien sûr vous connaissez tous, qui est donc professeur adjoint à la faculté des sciences sociales de l'Université d'Ottawa et que l'on va entendre aujourd'hui parce que tu vas nous présenter un travail que tu as réalisé avec Emily Laxer et qui portait sur l'articulation entre populisme et religion et religieux plus largement, au-delà du spectre occidental dans lequel on a tendance un petit peu à s'enfermer, même si le panel de ce matin nous permettait justement de prendre un petit peu de hauteur. Et puis, plus précisément, ta présentation devrait nous proposer des outils d'analyse pour l'étude comparée des populismes religieux dans une perspective Est-Ouest. Donc, nous t'écoutons.
Merci beaucoup, Djamila, pour cette introduction. Je pense que j'ai un petit problème avec mon PowerPoint, mais je suis en train de... OK, je pense que ça marche. Je vais partager mon écran. Et je vais continuer en anglais parce que dans ce travail, Émilie et moi, on se concentre sur la littérature anglophone particulièrement. OK. C'est visible? OK. Est-ce que c'est visible, le diapositive? OK. Timing myself. So welcome back, everyone. So Emily and I, we've been working on this project in the past few months, and our title is Religious Populism Beyond the West, Toward a Comparative Agenda. And we'd like to discuss in this work how, in different ways, religion gets articulated by populists and vice versa. So beginning with a general framework, there have been 2 parallel developments since the 1980s that have been recognized in the literature. The first one is the increasing prominence of religions in social and political life. In the sociology of religion, people like Jose Casanova or Peter Berger have touched upon this, saying that religions are going public and there's an increasing desecularization of the world. Parallel in time, we also see an increase in the rise of right and left-wing populist politics around the world that has been recognized in the literature and that we've been talking about in the past 2 days. So given this situation, the relationship between those 2 parallel movements have not been theorized in a sufficient manner. There's an emergent literature on the populism-religion nexus, but it's emergent. So it's only in the past few years that people have significantly began considering this relationship. What we found in this literature, Emily and me, the engagement of the religious perspective on populism has a limited outlook on, or like a little knowledge on the diverse theories of populism, and it doesn't consider the theories of populism with an integrative approach that takes into consideration the various dimensions. And one of the reasons for this, we argue, is that the focus is predominantly on Europe and the United States. So that's why it only gives a limited picture of the full scope of how populism and religion may, in fact, interact. So our goal is to advance the analytical framework to facilitate cross-regional and cross-religious comparisons. So how do we do this? First, we engage with the theories of populism. It's primarily a theoretical paper with case studies. And we hope to take an integrative approach, meaning we bring together the ideational, the performative stylistic, and the political strategic dimensions of populism. I'm going to mention later that the literature at the moment focuses mainly on the ideational aspect and leaves aside the other two. And then, based on these tripartite distinction or the approaches to populism, we'll discuss how religion might come into the picture as discourse, as performance, or as strategy or institutional arrangements or mobilization strategies. And based on this theoretical framework, then we're going to make a distinction between two possible modes of religious populism or how religion and populism may interact. The covert kind and the overt kind. So there's been some basis for this in the literature, and we're advancing what already exists. The covert kind refers to sacralizing the political, and the examples I'll talk about are France and Quebec, in which organized religions are mobilized only to a limited extent. Traditional religions are only as part of identity, but not really a central component of populist politics. Whereas in the overt mode of religious populism, politicizing the sacred, I'll give the examples of India and Turkey, and this is where the traditional religions are more explicitly utilized for political purposes, and then I'll draw some conclusions. So let's begin with the theories of populism. The ideational approach, as I believe you're mostly familiar, the people and the elite distinction and the others that are not part of the people, that are not part of the elite, mostly the minorities. The ideational approach might include the ideological definition, but not limited to that, or discourse, including Laclau and Mouffe's theory according to Bonikowski and Gidron. And as you know, populists are not just anti-elite, but they're also anti-pluralist, as Müller has underlined in his 2016 work, meaning in this famous formulation, they and only they can represent the people. And that means the denigration of any potential competitor to power as illegitimate to begin with. It has been also mentioned that this vertical axis overlaps very neatly with the horizontal axis of insider and outsider distinction formed by nationalism, as Peker has reminded us recently. And kind of related to what Stefan was talking about yesterday, the people can be defined in this framework as ethnos, based on the cultural framework, as plebs, meaning as a socioeconomic underdog, or as demos, meaning a sovereign community. But populism is not limited to this. It's not just discourse, but it's also performative style, according to scholars like Moffat, meaning the leader especially embodies the people with usually his folksy conduct and bad manners. But that's a way to stick it to the establishment and to say that we're not we're not following the formal rules of politics, as you can see Donald Trump on the right-hand side. But also it helps demarcating the people from the others, because the others cannot understand, allegedly, these performances or culturally specific stylistic sort of acts. So it's a way to differentiate the people from those two groups. And additionally, populism is also a political strategic approach, or it has been studied as such. Scholars like Wayland and Barr recently underline populism's mobilization capacities and modes of political organization. Wayland particularly underlines how populist leaders create an unmediated mass support and bypass traditional institutions and create novel affiliations with social movements and focus on institution building based on that personalized approach. So how does religion come into this picture? As I said, it's an understudied relationship, but one significant work in 2016 has been Saving the People by Marzuki, MacDonald, and Olivier Roy. So focusing on the European and the American cases, in this book, they talk about mostly the discursive aspect or the ideational aspect of populism. What does religion do? It fills the empty signifier of the people. It sacralizes them and moralizes the cause. Kind of linked to what Mathieu talked about emotions coming into the picture and fear being provoked. Religion is being used to be able to do those things because it provides some specific cultural resources, and it might also invoke a mission of salvation, usually with a charismatic leader. But what we come to notice is that performative and the strategic dimensions are under-examined, and this is because we're mostly looking at Western populisms and not seeing the whole picture. So how does it work if we apply religion to these three different levels? By the way, I should underline that there are different theories of populism as well as an economic approach, for instance, but we didn't include those because these are the most prominent ones that are accepted in the social scientific literature. So discursive ideational one is kind of straightforward. It helps boundary making, especially to define people as ethnos. And also to create a Manichaean good and evil dichotomy. And we talked about India before and how Modi creates ethnos based on the real people in the definition, based on the Hindu majority, Sunni majority in Turkey, or evangelicals or Christian white majority in the United States, and so on. So that's the first sort of preliminary use of religion. Instead of saying race, instead of saying whiteness, it kind of works as a dog whistle, basically, to separate the people from the rest of, especially the other. But also, in addition to this, religion serves a performative, stylistic purpose. And as you can see in these pictures over here, for Modi meditating in different temples and carefully posting them on Instagram. I've been following him, by the way. It's really fun. It's kind of politics as usual. The same thing for Donald Trump. You may remember in the summer that during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, he posed with a Bible in his hand in front of the St. John's Church in Washington as police were beating up the protesters. So these are ways that go beyond just pure language or discourse or ideas, but religious tropes, attitudes, clothing, rituals, ceremonies, they highlight the people, among other things, sometimes also as plebs. Especially Modi does that when he talks about his religious and also poor background as a chaiwala or as a tea boy. And finally, as a strategic organizational component, and this is the one that's particularly missing in the studies focusing on Western populisms, religion might help underpin the movement in significant ways. So in the West, that's mostly external backing. In the case of Donald Trump, for instance, the evangelicals backing Donald Trump, and it's kind of a strategic relationship, but it's not really an embedded relationship. Donald Trump does not embed religion in any meaningful way. But if you look at the cases of India, and I'll talk about that in a second, such as the RSS and the Sangh Parivar, the BJP is a manifestation of the movement, is a part of the movement. It's not vice versa. The same thing in Turkey, significant relationships between the religious orders and the government. So the strategic aspect is understudied because the focus is mostly on the West. And this relationship might also sanctify the leader as the embodiment of demos, embodiment of sovereignty of the real people, and helps setting policy agendas. Could be based on abortion, could be based on any other cultural, part of the cultural wars. So based on these three-level definitions of populism-religion relationship. We make the distinction, building on Zuchet and some earlier works, two modes of populism. The first one is overtly religious, politicizing the sacred. So this is where traditional religions are explicitly invoked, and religious doctrines and themes as well, to legitimize a particular order. And we highlight that if a movement rallies traditional religions, direct ways as discourse, performance, or strategy, or a combination thereof, then it comes closer to politicizing the sacred, or overtly religious. If it's vice versa, sorry, if it's not, that's not it. If it's doing this implicitly, meaning not directly alluding to religions, but using those symbols kind of as a background methodology with a weaker connection with traditional religions, then it's covertly religious. So political actors implicitly consecrate or re-enchant otherwise secular political institutions as almost like a quasi-religious institutions. So to give you a few examples from sacralizing the political or the covert way of utilizing religion. We've talked in the morning about how, and yesterday, how Marine Le Pen defines the people as Christian origin, French white citizens. The elites are the ones that are EU supporters, traditional parties, and so on. The others being the Muslims. And Marine Le Pen here is in front of the statue of Jeanne d'Arc, which has not only national connotations, but also religious ones. And she carefully uses this religious meanings and symbols without really saying that she is a full supporter of Christianity. In fact, she has said that she's a believer, but strongly against the church because the church has undermined its populist rhetoric. Another way of sacralizing politics is when Nicolas Sarkozy talked about, when I enter a mosque, I remove my shoes, and when a young Muslim girl enters school, she must remove her headscarf. So the school is being reframed as a sacred institution, a sacred place, and the republic being a sacred government. If we give an example from Quebec, and this morning Emily and others talked about that, I won't go into the details for the moment, but we've talked about, I remember Olivier talked about how there's a sacralization of Catholicism, but not necessarily as religion, but as heritage and culture and background. So François Legault says he wishes that God exists. So this is not something as implicit as you would find in the discourses of Modi and Erdogan. I hope God exists. You don't hear Erdogan say that. But instead, in Quebec, you see the culturalization, or what Zabriskie called patrimonialization of religion. Our government is sacred, and neutralité religieuse de l'État, égalité homme-femme, as we spoke this morning, these are all sacred. So there's a sacralization, and only using religion in implicit ways, and as opposed to explicit ways. I've just passed 15 minutes, so I'll try to wrap up, but I want to touch upon the India and Turkish cases very quickly so that we are able to compare well. In India, religion is being used to politicize the sacred, or in a way that politicizes the sacred, so which is a much more explicit way of using religion. And the people are the Hindu majority, the elites are the Congress, secular, deconnected from the people, and the others are the Muslim minority. And the specific example that India brings is RSS, or Rashtriya, I won't try to pronounce it. So the RSS is an organization that was founded in the 1920s, and the BJP came out of the RSS. And this is a huge, major social movement, including educational, labor and agricultural institutions, media, think tanks, economic groups, and social services. So it has penetrated to all segments of Indian society, and the BJP is the political arm of that. This is the kind of institutional or mobilization connection that we don't see in the West. And similarly in Turkey, the people are the Sunni majority, the elites are the Republican People's Party from Atatürk to today, and the others could be Alevis and Kurds and secular masses and so on. But again, we see a very different institutional arrangement. Diyanet, or the Director of Religious Affairs, in 1924, it was founded to minimize or to control and in time diminish the social significance of religion. I've argued that elsewhere. But under the AKP government, there's been a retransformation or reconfiguration of this institution with huge budget boosts and also the penetration of religion with active government support and funding to every aspect of society, from TV to halal meat and different partnerships with institutions and so on. And religion is brought up for abortion, gender roles, economic policy, social media, and so on to support the government. So to conclude, what we're saying is that we have to diversify the religion populism nexus. It has been focusing too much on the West, which gives us only a limited picture. With India, we're seeing a grassroots mobilization network like the RSS, the likes of which cannot be found in Europe because the relationship with the Catholic Church is very weak for the case of European populists. And in Turkey, we see a comprehensive institutional change and repurposing of an institution to push religion, again, the likes of which we're not seeing. So that's why religion is not just contributing to the populist discourse, but also different performances and strategies, mobilization aspects of populism that is being ignored, we believe, so far. And so that's why going beyond Western cases would help us see not only the sacralizing the political or the covert uses of religion, but also politicizing the sacred, the more direct and explicit uses of religion. And as we go forward, there are a few topics that we have in mind. One of them is in global comparisons should be sensitive to religious differences across cases. So that's one thing we have in mind. Other thing is we haven't really touched upon left-wing populisms yet. All the examples that I've been giving are mostly on nativist uses of religion. So that's something to think about. And the other one is the role of international relations or the extranational affairs in the shaping of populist, religiously populist discourses and practices. So let me stop there. And thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer questions in English, English or French. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Effet. C'était vraiment fascinant et en plus, ça venait parfaitement venir conclure ou ouvrir un petit peu le débat par rapport à ce dont on a discuté ce matin à propos des exemples indiens et turcs. Donc, c'est absolument parfait. Je propose qu'on passe tout de suite à la présentation de Hasan. I'm going to speak in English for this one, even if my English has a very strong French accent. So we're going to conclude the table with you, Hasan, Faruk, Uslu. So as I've said, you are maître de conférence. I really don't know how to say this in English. I'm really sorry. At the Faculty of Economical Science of the University of Atatürk. And you published a few books in political sociology, in compared politics, and in social politics. So I'm very excited to hear you today because you're going to question the hegemony of political sciences in the field of populism, on the basis that populism used to be really studied by economics and or the sociologists, and now it's more monopolized by the politics. So I'm really excited to hear you. Et c'est à toi.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be part of such a good conference. And I just want to send my thanks to the organizers. I just want to use PowerPoint and let me share my screen. Is it visible? Is there a problem? Okay. Today, I just want to make an argument on the general reflections on the state of the contemporary literature. And I shall say that this is a critical review of the current state of the literature. And as a title, I choose that the hegemony of the liberal and empiricist political science in the contemporary populism literature. Let me state my problematic and research questions in the study. I argue that although the historical seeds of the current literature could be found in the American revisionism of the 1950s and 60s, in which the historians and sociologists of American liberalists and the Cold War liberals are very effective, the hegemony of liberal and empirical and exclusively European political science in the contemporary populism literature remains to be taught. Then I just want to ask why. And within this perspective, this study will try to tackle with the following questions. What have been the contributions of this literature to our understanding on the contested concept of populism? Which mechanisms have been used to that end? And what purposes exactly it has served for? I am sure that you all may be aware of the famous book, the Oxford Handbook of Populism. And I just want to use two quotations from this collective study. The first one is, the academic interest in populism has been driven by different disciplines. I think the authors considered the sociologists and the historians within the social sciences. And it is only since the 1980s, the political science began to take ownership of this topic. And I just want to ask why since the 1980s? It's a critical question, I think, that we have to ask to the current literature. The second quotation from that book is, it is very interesting for me. It is worth noting that there is one type of conceptual approach that we have deliberately excluded, that is the definition centered on economy. And the authors go on, in fact, despite their different understandings of populism, Mütte, Weyland, and Osterger share the idea that populism should not be defined on the basis of a specific type of economic policies. And in my view, this is to say that social classes and capitalism is put aside out of consideration in the contemporary literature. And this is really, seems to be something very interesting for me. When we look at the general reflections on the contemporary literature, especially the critical views, there is one type of argument that we have overused the term. For that reason, the term maybe eventually has to be deleted from the vocabulary of social sciences, or we have to go beyond or move beyond the populism studies. A second line of argument argues that it is a cloak by setting aside the full question of fascism, neo-fascism, post-fascism, in order to legitimize or make sympathetic, especially considered for the far right. And this is put forward by John Bellamy Foster. And Michael Levy argues that the hegemony of the populism literature in the contemporary world, it is used in a deliberately mystifying way to bring about an amalgamation between the far right and the radical left. Both, in other words, it is to use to say both of these far right and left wing radical left opposing the neoliberal centrist policies. As you know, the concept of populism continues to mean a variety of different things to a variety of different authors and perspectives. However, the contemporary literature, it should be argued that, seems to have certain tendencies. And moving on the regime, I choose only the three one. It is argued that an increasing agreement among scholars on how the term should be defined, and especially populism as a set of ideas, populism as a teen-centered ideology, populism as a discourse, or populism as a style, seems to be hegemonic in this definitional problems. And I propose that we can read it, the supremacy of ideational approach, and the supremacy of approaching populism mainly as a political phenomenon. The second tendency is to be argued that a shift from conceptualizing populism towards measuring it. Thus, it may be parallel to the first tendency. There is an agreement on how to define the term. Then the second step should be measuring it. Thus, the studies mainly focusing on study of messages, discourses, or election manifestos. And third, to a certain extent, populism for a long time has been studied in populism in opposition. But however, for the last 20 or 30 years, as the populist movements gaining the power or becoming part of the governments, populism in power or populism in governments, an increasing attention paid to the populism in power or populism in governments. This helps some students of populism to study the relationship between populism and in my view, the liberal democracy, and thus it paved the way for the arguments, a deviation from centrist liberal democracy or the rise of illiberal democracy in power. My central thesis, especially moving on the footsteps of Marco de Ramo and Anton Yega, the contemporary literature is hardly new. It seems to be re-articulated from the 1950s and 1960s American revisionism and pluralism. What the 1950s and 60s American revisionism and pluralism did was attributing all the pejorative connotations to the word of or to the concept of populism. It may be argued that although the Americans have retracted from their positions and started to think populism in a more positive way, but the European political science still considered is mainly on pejorative terms. There may be two novelties in this current literature, but these are very small novelties. The first one should be that the discourse of twin totalitarianism has been carried over into the theory of extremes. And the second one, the attention has been diverted from social forces or classes or the current state of capitalism behind the phenomenon. What this contemporary literature has contributed to our understanding, I just propose that, inspired by Göran Terborn's path-breaking study, this whole literature maybe help us to study on the power over and the power to, but the literature remains silent on the power from. I just want to say the power over or as a line of or as a perspective looks to the power holders of the society. Thus, the current literature really help us to understand the power holders of this contemporary populism literature, such as the populist leaders, their discourses, their strategies, or their charisma. And secondly, yes, this literature really help us to understand what to do with the increasing powers of these populist leaders, such as the famous slogan of both the Americans and the Brexiteers, that let's make the nation great again, or let's turn back to the golden days of the past. But however, in my view, the contemporary literature, to a great extent, remains silent on power or populism in what kind of a society in terms of power flow, thus putting aside the problems of class struggles, capitalism, and precaria. Let me just give an example. The famous Müller's book on what is populism. There is only one references to capitalism and only 5 references to the neoliberalism. This is really something very interesting for me. Which mechanisms have been used? Just to give only one example, I just pick the Guardian's famous "How Populist Are You?" quiz. It is rumored that almost 2 million people have done this quiz, and the final chart, Guardian proposes that, as you see, Barack Obama and Emmanuel Macron seems to be more left than Evo Morales. This is really something myopic in the current literature, how Obama and Macron is put onto the left of Evo Morales, really something very interesting. Some may argue that it seems to be disastrous. Centrist champions like Barack Obama and Emmanuel Macron, both of whom pursued classically neoliberal agendas involving historical tax cuts, are located to the left of Bolivian President Evo Morales, who has pursued policies of nationalization and wealth distribution for years. And as the same chart, as you look to the right side, you see Donald Trump to the right of Viktor Orban. This is also something very interesting, how to put Donald Trump to the more right than Viktor Orban. And this seems to be, for me, it is about the myopia of the current populism literature. And as a conclusion, I should argue that we should talk about a Pyrrhic victory for the populism studies. Populism now became an industry in its own. There is no doubt, I think, but it loses its analytical utility once it has that analytical utility, but now it seems to lose its analytic utility. The second conclusion that can be derived from the current literature, it's the ahistorical state of contemporary populism studies. Now it's really difficult to convince Europeans that once populism signified something other than pure demagoguery and the proto-fascism. And in my view, as a proposition, we need to historically contextualize the populism studies and to join the discipline or the studies of populism, other disciplines such as political economy, political sociology, etc. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. It was absolutely amazing. I think we probably have a lot of questions, so I'm going to keep mine extremely short to give you more room. I think we really saw the link between each presentation today, and so I'm gonna go straight to my questions to each of you. I was really interested in your critical presentation, Faruk, because I think we kind of needed this after 1.5 days of studying populism. So I guess I kind of have a blatant, also kind of naive question, and then another one. The first one would be, listening to you, populism has been really used in a very political and acritical way over the last few years or even decades. So would you still think it's interesting to use it as an analytical term? And if so, under what conditions should we sometimes prefer not to use it at all and prefer using the term of fascism or nationalism, even if it's really a broad question? And I have a second one, which is really about the slide you presented. Wait, where is it? Yes, it's a slide you presented about the tendencies in the contemporary populism literature. And I'm actually curious about the third point. I think I did not really understand what you meant by increasing attention to populism in power and the deviation from centrist liberal democracy or the rise of liberal democracy. So if you could just expand on that point, I would be very interested. To keep it short, I'm going to move to Effet. So
I am so sorry. Would you make your first question? Would you state once again your first question?
It was really a broad question that probably
I couldn't follow. I am sorry.
Oh, okay. I guess my question would have been, I've heard that you have been critical of the use of the term populism over the last few years / decades in social studies. And I think my question would have been, when you think it's not convenient, it's not analytically pertinent to use it, and when should we potentially use much more the term of fascism or nationalism? Because I feel like sometimes the border between those categories is not super clear. So what would be your opinion on this? For effet, j'étais vraiment, je continue en français, j'étais vraiment intéressée par la question de overtly or covertly religious. Et en fait, cette idée de réenchantement du politique par la voie religieuse, je trouvais que ça venait aussi répondre à ma présentation sur la question de du travail de réimagination du politique, parce qu'en fait, ça passe par la voie du religieux. Alors, j'ai pas vraiment de questions, sinon peut-être comment est-ce que vous avez fait avec Émilie pour essayer d'expliquer les différences dans ces stratégies, ou plutôt, qu'est-ce qui vous semble qui puisse décider qu'on utilise une stratégie plutôt qu'une autre? Qu'est-ce qui fait que certains contextes mobilisent une stratégie ouverte ou non ouverte? Ou qu'est-ce qui fait que dans un pays donné ou dans une unité nationale donnée, on passe d'une stratégie ouverte à une stratégie discrète, disons? Je vais en rester là parce que j'aurais beaucoup à dire sur ce sujet. And the last one was for Mathieu. I really adore that presentation. Thank you so much. It's really c'est vraiment mon sujet principal, donc ça me fascine beaucoup. Je vais m'en tenir à une seule. Tu parlais à un moment des liens entre inégalité et populisme, et tu évoques deux possibilités qui sont mises en avant par la psychologie, qui serait que la montée des inégalités augmenterait le besoin psychologique de se démarquer, ou bien, autre possibilité, l'appui pour le populisme serait lié au sentiment de privation matérielle. Alors, je voulais savoir, selon toi, quelle serait la piste la plus prometteuse? Et puis, si on a un petit peu de temps, j'aimerais beaucoup savoir la manière dont toi, d'un point de vue méthodologique, tu penses qu'on puisse aller capter ces émotions avec les outillages de la sociologie et non pas ceux de la psychologie. Et voilà, je me tais maintenant et je vous écoute. Donc, je ne sais pas qui veut commencer, par contre, Faruk, peut-être. Do you want to start?
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. For your first question, as far as I can understand, you should ask, I just want to make the point, this contemporary literature should be labeled as the third or fourth wave of populism. As you know, the early examples of populist movements, such as the Narodniks in Russia and the People's Party in America, especially as the 19th century developments. Once the examples of these movements, the concept of populism was used more positively, considering the Russian Narodniks and American People's Party. And I argue that without paying greater attention to their historical context, the current wave of populism studies basically following the second wave, which I call American revisionists and pluralists. The second wave put all the negative connotations to the word and make very similar populist movements very similar to the fascist or proto-fascist or neo-fascist movements. Then I said that the early understanding of populism has been shifted. The more positive understanding of populism has been shifted to the more pejorative understanding of populism. And the current literature, for me, totally following the idea of second wave of studies of populism, such as all the pejorative connotations of populism. Just to give an example, populism is generally pinned on you as an epithet by your opponents. As far as I know, only one or two political leaders in the world currently can admit that he or she is populist. The huge majority do not use that I am populist or something like that. For that reason, it seems to be an epithet pinned on you by your opponents. And I said, without paying greater attention to the historical context and take all the pejorative connotations and put it into the populism studies, this makes the concept lose its analytical utility, because once upon a time, to say populism to somebody, it was something very nice to become a populist. But today, populism used as an pejorative word. And your second question, I argue that especially the so-called populist movements gaining power or become part of the governments, then the attention has been shifted from studying populism in opposition to the studying populism in power. What these populist leaders do or did to the democracy. And I said, this makes some centrist academics to make a relationship between populism in power and how this populism in power diminished the liberal democracy. It paved the way for them to argue that this is a threat to the liberal democracy, or this is an illiberal response to the democratic problem of liberal democracy. And I argue that this is a strategic choice to study populism in power more exclusively. Does it make sense? I don't know, but...
Yes, completely. Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Et, merci Djamila pour cette question. Je vais répondre en anglais. So the question is why one method and not the other? Why covert use of religious populism or the overt use? So I should have highlighted, I think, a bit better that we've thought of these terms as ideal types and not necessarily as completely mutually exclusive, but we wanted to think of this as to make sense of these different ways of interacting with religion on a spectrum. So if on the one hand side of the spectrum, we're thinking about the covert use of religiosity, what comes to mind is some European right-wing nativist movements as example. And in one other study, content analysis that I made, I've included right-wing parties that Peker has established as civilizationist or like a cultural populist. And this includes Norway, Sweden, and Denmark in the north, and the Netherlands, and Belgium, France, and Austria, and Switzerland. And so these are the ones that come closer to the covert use of religiosity. And I've studied their like party declarations and election manifestos and so on. And thank you, Google Translate. And they highlight Christianity without exception as a civilizational identity, but they also say that it's thanks to Christianity that we have a secular society that is based on gender equality and so on. So not too different from what we've seen this morning about France and Quebec. And if we move on the spectrum a bit, you see that, and this is what Peker has recognized as well, like Poland and Hungary, or the case of Orban, for instance, would be placed more closer to, again, somewhere in the middle, but more overt compared to these examples, a bit more overt uses of religiosity, because, and your question was, I think, why this strategy and not the other? So one answer that comes to mind is if this is going to resonate with the population or not. If in Quebec, if in Norway, you wanted to do like a religious politics like Erdogan, probably would not really have that much support. In the US, moving alongside the spectrum, there's a stronger dimension, there's a stronger mass support for this kind of politics and direct institutional connections or affiliations, especially with the evangelicals as well. So that's why it's coming closer to the overt kind, especially because of that third dimension I mentioned, the institutional kind. And then Turkey and India more to the overt kind because of the reasons explained. But of course, one can go further on the spectrum, including constitutionally religious regimes and how those are being used in populist ways or movements. So in one sentence, the answer would be, I think, the extent to which it's going to resonate with voters and with the rest of the population would change the ways in which religion is being used by populist movements, I would say.
Thank you. Mathieu, si tu veux continuer peut-être.
Oh, mon micro était fermé. Okay. Alors, oui, alors, encore une fois, moi, mon intérêt pour le populisme, envers le populisme, est vraiment tributaire à mon projet de recherche sur les inégalités. Encore une fois, je répète toujours, les gens vont être tannés de l'attendre, articuler l'objectif, le subjectif et le normatif. Alors, ce que j'ai finalement, et ça faisait longtemps que je voulais conceptualiser, quel est le rôle du populisme dans les inégalités? Et il y a un effet très documenté. Alors là, je ne dis pas bien sûr que les inégalités, c'est la seule source du populisme. Loin de ça, mais c'est une cause qui est assez documentée et ça a un grand effet. Et quand, justement, quand c'est Faruk, il mentionne l'absence de classe dans les analyses, ben, étrangement, c'est peut-être contre-intuitif, mais vous allez trouver des études en psychologie qui incluent la classe. Et d'ailleurs, il y a des modèles très sophistiqués qui montrent les effets entre les conditions, l'état finalement, des conditions politiques au niveau macro avec les facteurs individuels liés aux inégalités, liés à la classe, le statut, les attentes, la perception, privation absolue, privation relative, subjective. Étrangement, c'est peut-être davantage le rôle de la sociologie de s'intéresser à la classe, mais moi, j'ai trouvé mon compte finalement dans cette littérature psychologique qui est à la fois encourageant et désolant un peu, mais c'est à la relève des sociologues aussi de creuser la question. Par rapport à ta question sur les émotions, très intéressant. Ton point de vue méthodologique, c'est finalement comment mesurer les émotions et les intégrer dans une analyse sociologique, que ce soit de manière qualitative ou quantitative. La question n'est pas évidente. Moi, je te dirais que mon point d'entrée dans l'émotion, c'est récent que je m'intéresse à ça. Présentement, je donne un séminaire sur la normativité. Justement, je m'intéresse beaucoup à comment intégrer la rationalité axiologique dans la rationalité de l'acteur social. Et ce que j'ai réalisé en parlant avec mes étudiants au gré des discussions, c'est que la rationalité axiologique est en lien avec les émotions. La rationalité axiologique, si on veut, on a tous en tant qu'acteurs un mobile de valeurs. Certaines de ces valeurs ne sont pas en contradiction, c'est-à-dire qu'on peut les satisfaire sans problème, mais certaines de ces valeurs sont en contradiction, d'autant plus dans un contexte de temps limité et de ressources limitées, ce qui force les gens à faire des sacrifices dans leurs valeurs. Et l'émotion intervient justement quand eux doivent sacrifier une valeur pour une autre. Si on veut la réflexion sur quelle valeur va être priorisée, il y a des paramètres d'émotion là-dedans qui interviennent. Et même si je n'ai rien à te proposer en ce moment méthodologiquement, comment le mesurer et tout ça, d'un point de vue épistémologique, je trouve que mon point d'entrée dans l'émotion, c'est à travers la rationalité axiologique. Aussi avec l'idée finalement que, surtout avec des collègues avec qui je travaille en France sur la justice, on voit que quand on fait des sondages quantitatifs et font les analyses, si on a l'équité et le sentiment de justice intervient beaucoup pour comprendre finalement les opinions des gens en ce qui concerne la justice distributive. Et alors là, si on veut, l'émotion, ça m'intéresse pour essayer de comprendre quelles sont les conditions objectives qui permettraient aux gens de poursuivre des valeurs que j'oserais dire un petit peu plus nobles si on pense aux travaux de moralité de Kohlberg, etc. Alors, moi, je dirais, moi, ce serait mon point d'entrée. Et si tu dis que tu travailles dans le domaine de la sociologie des émotions, alors moi, ça me ferait plaisir de rentrer en dialogue avec toi et d'en discuter à une autre prise.
Merci beaucoup. Et oui, avec plaisir, parce que dans les 11 prochaines minutes, je vais essayer d'ouvrir la discussion aux autres. Donc, on a plusieurs questions. So we have one from Santoshi Kumari, if she's still here with us, but I think so. I think your question was, you wanted to know more about the presentation of Efe. I don't know if Efe, you saw the question. Basically, the question is, I would like to know more on the point you made that BGP is a manifestation of the movement and not vice versa. So maybe we can start with this question first.
Okay. So I would like my friends from colleagues from India to correct me, but based on the literature that I've been following, what I've seen is that first the BJS, the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, and sorry for the pronunciation, and later the BJP are movements that came out of the RSS, which is much older, as you know, dating back to 1925. So what I wanted to argue by that, or highlight by that, is that we don't see in the European or North American cases, but what we see is they're religious groups, and then politics try to sort of articulate them or mobilize them. But in this case, the historical development shows that the RSS developed first and penetrated into various levels of or components of civil society, and then the BJS first in 1951, and then the BJP in the 1980s were founded as the political arm of the RSS movement. So this, for me, is something very specific that we miss if we just look at the European cases to study the populism-religion nexus. But do correct me if I'm wrong with that observation.
So I don't know if Santoshi Kumari wants to answer. Otherwise, I'm just going to move to the next one. I don't know if it was an open question or not, but
yes. Thank you so much, Peker. Yes, of course, you tried to put it in a historical context, and that's very true. But I was just curious that when I understood it, that the movement started first and then the political, maybe I was wrong in getting what you wanted to say, that the movement of Babri Masjid or temple or appropriation of the sacred space began at one end and the political party tried to appropriate. That's what I understood, but I completely agree what you're saying. And I always see it as a complementary thing. Both the sacred space was used as a political agenda by BJP, RSS, Shiv Sena, and all the right-wing political parties. And at the same time, even these movements, when they started, there were people who wanted that, the very idea that Babri Masjid was a case registered in 1885, and there were people who wanted to reclaim the space. So it's a complementary kind of a thing, which the people want to appropriate the sacred space. For that, the political they use the political party, they use the leaders to appropriate that demand, and at the same time, the political parties also use these opportunities to realize their political ambition. That's what my understanding was. But however, when you put it in a historical context, definitely that's how, the way you explain, that's how it has progressed. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Santosh.
Yeah.
So I think there was a little debate on the side of my computer between Rohan and Faruk. So I don't know if you want to express it out loud or if I can just give my
as far as I can see, there are hands, I think, raised for the questions or comments, but I don't know what to do. If maybe you can deal with them. There are hands raised, I think, for the questions or comments.
Okay, well, for this one, it's Djamila running the show, so
I'm
sorry.
The one.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I don't know if it was really a question that Rohan was asking, but I'm going to read it out loud for everyone. You were asking, is the discourse on populism today is by and large the elitist understanding of populism, which was really connected to the presentation of Faruk, who answered. So I don't know if for you, you're fine here, or you want to develop that point a little bit.
I totally agree that there is an elitism in the anti-elitist discourse of populism. It seems that the leader saying that I can only the me can represent the nation, or I am the incarnation of the whole nation, seems to be a very elitist argument. For that reason, I totally agree with the idea that there is an elitism in the anti-elitist discourse of populism. And as you see, as far as I can remember, it was in the book of Taggart, it was said that the populist leader seems to be extraordinary man speaking for the ordinary people. And this seems to be something very odd, I think, in my view.
I was talking by myself. So thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Frédéric Guillaume Dufour, who had a question for Mathieu, probablement en français.
Yeah, well, since I think we have like a couple of people speaking English, I might do something weird and ask my question to Mathieu in English, just for this round, and to bring in Mathieu back in the conversation. So Mathieu, my question is targeting the question of interdisciplinary work, and when you address the work of people in psychology, and coming from a political science and sociological perspective, I'd like to bring back a couple of comments on social class here. And you say that in psychology, you meet a lot of people or study who talks about class, but my impression is that the way they talk about class is very different from the way we do. Or at least I do not expect to find like an expert on E.P. Thompson among the psychologists, you know, even less about Althusser and even less about Gramsci. So if we're just saying that like there is like economic disparity and that we can have like a geological conception of class, that's good for maybe for psychologists, but it doesn't really work for us. And it doesn't tell us a lot of thing about substance about class here. So I wonder how you deal with this and how you negotiate between psychology and sociology on this question.
Okay, a great question. It's true they don't approach class exactly the same way. But sociologists, you know, approach class in a wide variety of ways, right? So basically, you seem to be taking account more the relational aspect than the gradational aspect. And it is true that in psychology, from what I've seen, they have more of the gradational aspect of class. But for me, that's fine in the sense that I'm always interested in, gender always matters, yes. Race always matters, yes, but class also matters. And always did and always will. So while it's true that, yeah, it would be interesting to, it's not exactly, I don't think it's going to satisfy your needs, but it satisfies my needs in some ways, because any study that shows how economic phenomena structures social life and affects political life is interesting for me. And right now I'm we just started it about 6 months ago in the Canadian section, a new section in the Canadian Sociological Association, just on class, and where there's a bunch of scholars, you know, young and with more experience, that are trying to actually see, well, you know, we made the constat, we made the realizations that the relational aspect hasn't been really approached properly in a long time, especially in Canada. And so we want to actually try to bring it back and see what we can do and to analyze Canadian society. So, you know, I can put you in contact. It'd be great if you wanted to join us or at least be part of the conversation.
Can I do a quick follow-up on this one? Just because my impression looking at the especially the American case, is that you need to bring class trajectory in the equation. You know, it's because you have all this post-war Fordist working class who have been able to get these 80,000 salary a year and who've been really on the payroll of this political economy, who are losing control, who at least fear that they are losing control. So if you just look at their revenue, it doesn't tell you much about the historical substance of their trajectory in what you would have with a Thomsonian approach. That was where I was coming from. But yeah, I guess that Guillaume Duroux is probably one of the organizer of this panel on class or workshop. I'm totally in.
Oh, he actually isn't, but if he's interested in this, I'd love to get in touch with him. But it's true, you know, what I'm saying is basically you have to take studies that study class or economic phenomena in some ways. You have to take what you can get in some ways, and you have to articulate it and use it. And what you're suggesting about the idea of class trajectory and social mobility is very important. And in Canada, it's actually, you know, there has been very little studies on social mobility in the last 30 years. And one of the reasons is that we don't really have access to much data that allows to do that, right? It takes really special kind of longitudinal data. But recently there's been new panels added, which will allow us to, actually there's been quite a few studies in the last few years just because of new access to data. And I have actually a student working right now on social mobility with this data set. So I'm curious to see what results come out. But yeah, you know, I always, while I probably prefer a relational approach, you have to take into account data limitations also in people's methodological choices.
Thank you. I don't know if we have one final question or if we just take a small break for coffee. Ah oui, on t'écoute Olivier.
Oui, j'avais une question, c'est encore pour Mathieu Lizotte. J'ai trouvé très intéressante la présentation. C'est en fait, de façon générale, quelle relation vous entretenez avec la littérature sur le populisme par rapport à la question de la mentalité populiste, parce que ça semble être assez, une dimension assez présente de l'étude du populisme, c'est-à-dire de référer par exemple au style paranoïaque dont parle Hofstadter, le renvoi des fois à la question de la personnalité autoritaire, l'étude d'Adorno sur la mentalité fasciste qui est des fois réutilisée dans la littérature populiste. Puis comment est-ce que justement à partir de cette dimension-là qui est propre à une certaine littérature sur le populisme, comment est-ce qu'on peut éviter de tomber dans une ultra-psychiatrisation en fait des affects, de ce qui représente des affects populistes tels que désignés par les auteurs?
En tout cas, c'est une question fascinante. Encore une fois, moi, j'ai pas un projet d'étude qui porte là-dessus. Moi, quand j'ai vu ce colloque, j'ai vu l'opportunité finalement éclaircir les relations entre le populisme et l'inégalité. Je trouve que ta question est tout à fait fascinante. Et là ça nous porte plus finalement dans les grandes questions de comment on conceptualise et le rapport individu-société, holisme, individualisme méthodologique et essentiellement, ben, tout à l'heure, c'est peut-être pas clair, mais quand je dis d'arriver à une conceptualisation de la rationalité, une rationalité cognitive de l'acteur social, c'est une manière d'essayer d'intégrer l'aspect psychologique dans une analyse sociologique. Et en effet, il ne faut pas sombrer dans un pur psychologisme, je suis d'accord. Mais comme j'ai dit dans le résumé finalement de ma présentation, vous savez, il y a une certaine aversion corporatiste envers la psychologie en sociologie hein, qui remonte facilement à Durkheim et Tard, etc. Mais je pense qu'il arrive un moment aussi, il faut essayer d'une manière ou d'une autre, éventuellement, il faut être confronté à comment on intègre l'émotion, la psychologie dans la rationalité de l'acteur social et comment quel impact ça a sur la structure, quel impact ça a sur les enjeux politiques. C'est une grande question que tu poses et dans un sens, c'est que malgré toutes les études qu'on fait, qui sont très circonscrites, il y a toujours derrière, si on veut, une tentative d'arriver à une épistémologie sociale, une conceptualisation de comment étudier le social, qu'on peaufine finalement. Alors, je dirais, on pourrait s'en parler une autre fois, où on va voir où je vais être rendu dans 5 ans ou dans 10 ans par rapport à ça.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous propose qu'on s'arrête là. If it's fine for all of you, I think we're going to stop here. And if you want to continue with us, we'll have one final panel if you want to to continue on a Friday afternoon to talk about populism. So I'm going to send you the link right now so we won't lose you anywhere. It's going to appear in the conversation. Donc je vous l'envoie, hop, dans la conversation. And thank you very much. It was really, really amazing talks, and we are very grateful to have people who are really coming from a really like far away perspective, and probably it's quite far also for some of you, quite late. So thank you very much for staying with us, and we see you on the next panel.
Sounds great.